on campus, in person, in the room. Thank you, Mary Claire, and for setting this whole thing up. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who will start with the intros.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to introduce Mary Claire Freeman, our moderator for this event. She is part of the TAM class of 2015. And before TAM, Mary Claire worked for Teach for America in 2010 for 3 years, as well as being a special ed educator for a few years before applying to TAM. Mary Claire later found inspiration in Professor Stevens' class while learning about the North-South divide. Combined with a study abroad experience in Italy as an undergrad, she decided to go to Siena and complete her thesis on Italian sustainable development and how governance should be included in sustainability development indicators, previously limited to environmental, economic, and social. However, she also did a semester in Bath before Siena that she found to be the most rewarding because she found the engaging, interpersonal learning style very challenging but gratifying. Also in Bath before April, wherein she waited till the very last month to write all of her final papers in a sort of educational hell, she reveled in the ancient city and bustling university life. After her thesis module in DC while interning, she got a Fulbright to teach in Spain and study the Roma minority and their access to disability services and sustainability projects.
Hello, everyone. Everything came together when she was able to stay in Madrid and combine her love for Mediterranean culture with her passion for sustainable development. She was offered a position at Elmo Solutions, where she works as a director of institutional relations and finds clients in the sustainable development industry and links businesses with the US government. Her favorite part about her job is that she's able to build connections, work on her interpersonal communication and confidence, as well as supporting sustainable development. A fun story from her time working there. So she was driving the president of Bolivia to a hotel, and it was around 4 in the morning, and she was dressed up really nice because it's the president of Bolivia, and she was mistaken for his date when she reached the hotel. Yeah, so, but yes, she also loves her time in Madrid. Her favorite thing about Madrid is its central location and international travel. But she also has recommended her favorite dish, which is bull's tail, to us. And she said it tastes like pot roast. So thank you on behalf of all of us for moderating today's panel and spending time with us today.
And so I'm introducing Minister Cortez. The Honorable Dr. Minister Cortez is the Minister for the Environment, Sustainability, Climate Change, Heritage, and Culture, and the HM of the Government of Gibraltar. Formerly, he was the Director of Gibraltar Botanic Gardens and the General Secretary of the Gibraltar Ornithological and Natural History Society. His other appointments have included Justice of the Peace and President, Gibraltar Magistrates Association. Minister Cortez has a BSc in Botany and Zoology from Royal Holloway College, University of London, and a Doctorate of Philosophy from the Magdalen College and Animal Ecology Research Group. In 2003, he was awarded an MBE for services to ecology and conservation. His research interests include and reflect ornithology, plant and animal ecology, primatology, and conservation biology. Special interest in invasive species, reptile ecology, cliff ecology, phenology of migration, and ecology and behavior of Barbary macaques. Minister Cortez has field experience in Gibraltar, Spain, and North Africa, especially in Morocco. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Is that over to me now?
Yes, over to you now.
Great.
We'll fix the volume in the room.
You might ask yourself, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. You might ask yourselves after that introduction, what on earth I am doing in politics? And I hope that part of my presentation today will make you realize that you don't always end up where you expect to end up. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for this invitation. It came, as I'm sure you know, a very short time ago, just over 2 weeks ago. So I haven't sadly been able to prepare with the rigor I would normally prepare. I've been traveling for most of the last 2 weeks. I went to COP26 in Glasgow last week, and this week I was in London for the Joint Ministerial Council, which is a joint meeting of the government of the United Kingdom and all the 14 overseas territories of the UK that have a human population. There are some that don't, like South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands. So I've been traveling, so I haven't had the time that I would have liked. So this discussion, this talk will be qualitative rather than quantitative. I hope there's some quality in there too. I'd just like to put a couple of thoughts in your minds before I go into the meat of it. And this is very much how I am. And my thoughts are: believe in what you believe and with a passion. Focus on your aims and ambitions, but be open to unexpected changes in direction, because you might well end up doing something you never imagined you would. So that's the backdrop to this. I'm going to start with a little bit of history of Gibraltar to set the whole thing in context, a little bit about me, which I think is relevant, and then talk about government and governance in what is a small territory. So the title, effective government and environmental governance in small territories, but I wanted to just give the little bit of humor with calling it more than just monkeys, because for a long time, and perhaps still today, many people associate the Rock of Gibraltar with monkeys. And even visitors who come to Gibraltar come here expecting to see one big rock and one big monkey, which is what you've got on your screen right now. But as I think you realize, it's not like that at all. This gives us a location at the southern tip of Western Europe, just at the bottom end of Spain. If we try to zoom in a little bit, we are on the eastern end of the north shore of the Strait of Gibraltar, which is a critical passage. It is a site which is very important for migration. Birds concentrate in this, which is the shortest sea crossing between Africa and Europe, for a bird that prefers to fly over land, like soaring birds, birds of prey, and the like. It's also clearly a channel for migration of marine species, including marine seabirds, including whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and fish. Tuna, Atlantic bluefin tuna being an example. But apart from being a crossroads for migration, it's also been a crossroads for human civilizations. We are aware of the Mediterranean being the cradle of civilization even. And whereas for birds, the straits are a gap in the land that they have to cross, for those who plied the ancient seas, the seas were a bridge to Gibraltar and through the straits beyond into the Atlantic. Gibraltar is very small. I am where the blue, right now I'm sitting where that blue dot is now. Don't ask me what that red pin is doing there. I didn't put it in there deliberately. And you can see its context. The little aircraft shows you where the airfield is, which is built largely on reclaimed land. And just north of where the aircraft is the frontier with the Kingdom of Spain. You can see the Bay of Gibraltar to the west of the rock, and the port of Algeciras, which is the second largest container port in Europe after Rotterdam, just across the bay from Gibraltar. So this sets it in context. A lot of what's happened in Gibraltar has actually been almost an accident of geography. And because of its location, I've mentioned migration, I've mentioned the ancient seafarers, but Gibraltar clearly had a very strategic importance in more recent times, right through 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and very particularly during the World Wars, the Second World War in particular, and much more recently, the Falklands War, where Gibraltar was used as a staging post for both ships and aircraft on their way to the South Atlantic. If we can have a look at this, just to get a sense of the size of Gibraltar, I actually took this photograph out of the window of the aircraft when I was flying over to London on Sunday, beautiful clear day. You can see the steep slopes of the eastern side of the rock with very small areas which are populated. And you can then see on the western side of the rock, which peers over the crest of the rock, where the most built up area is. And you can see this from the north, looking south across the Strait of Gibraltar. The mountain across the strait is what's the other pillar of Hercules, which is Jebel Musa in Morocco. The northern pillar of Hercules was the Rock of Gibraltar. You can see the airfield there. You can see the town and the harbor of Gibraltar, all within approximately 2.5 square miles. It's a tiny, tiny location. Its population is about 33,000. Significantly, there are about 12 to 15,000 frontier workers who cross into Gibraltar every day to work. That will be relevant later when we look a little bit more at the politics. The geology of Gibraltar is limestone. It's a limestone mass thrust up by tectonic movements in what is an area surrounded by sandstone, which that has made the natural habitat in Gibraltar particularly important. It is an island, in effect, of limestone, and that has resulted in at least 6 endemic species or subspecies or varieties of plants found nowhere else in the world other than Gibraltar, 2 species of snails, and several species of beetles that are found only in Gibraltar. Gibraltar is very well known nowadays for its prehistory. A great deal of work has been done on Neanderthals by the Gibraltar National Museum at Gorham's Cave, which, together with its surrounding area, forms part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site known as Gorham's Cave Complex, which is a Neanderthal site. Remains have been found there of modern humans, but also of Neanderthal man. And the first ever Neanderthal skull was in fact found in Gibraltar sometime before another skull was found in the Neander Valley in Germany, hence the name Neanderthal, but nobody realized what they had discovered, and therefore we didn't call it Gibraltar man. Science knows it as Neanderthal man. They were known to have inhabited Gibraltar at least until 35,000 years ago, and they are the most recent known Neanderthal settlement to have survived. Very possibly, Gibraltar has always been a refuge through its history, may well have been a refuge for Neanderthals as modern man took over southern Europe after the last glaciation. Important, if you're interested in this sort of thing, and I would advise you to if you're interested in Neanderthal, to look at the Gibraltar Museum's website. They have the world leaders in Neanderthal research. But in those times, sea levels were much lower, and there would have been a coastal plain stretching about 3 kilometers to the east. That's to the left of this photograph, which is where Neanderthals would have hunted, fished, and so on. More recently, Gibraltar was known to the Phoenicians, and there have been Phoenician remains discovered in fact, in the same cave where most of the Neanderthal remains are, in Gorham's Cave. There are Roman remains as well, but Gibraltar was never settled permanently. There's no sign of permanent settlement until much later than that. Even the Visigoths and the Vandals, who the latter gave their name to Andalusia, which is the area of Spain that is to the north of Gibraltar, even they, although they were occupying Gibraltar between around 414 and 711. Even they did not have a permanent settlement of any size. That changed some 100 years later, although one significant point in the history of Gibraltar, indeed, in the history of Iberia, was the arrival by the Almohad dynasty of Moors in the year 711. They crossed to Algeciras, which they knew as Algezair al-Hadra, the Green Island. It looked very green from Morocco. And they crossed to Gibraltar, an expedition led by Tariq ibn Zaid, who it is thought gave its name to Gibraltar. Jebel being Mountal, Tariq being his name, Jebel Tariq having then been corrupted to Gibraltar. I have a different theory. I know that Gibraltar is, as I've said, is very significantly important for migrating birds. That could be the subject of another talk another day. On the right days, you can see thousands and thousands of large birds migrating over Gibraltar, much more so in 711. And as Tariq arrived in Gibraltar during the peak time of honey buzzard migration, I wouldn't be surprised if they called it Jebel Ta, because Ta is the Moorish word for bird. So I'd rather call it Mountain of Birds than have it named after a military commander. But there we are. That's just me. Gibraltar was still not permanently settled. They did build a castle and a tower, which had views to the north, west, and south. But it wasn't until around 1160 that the first permanent settlement on the western side of the rock, which is the gentler slope, was created by the Moors. It became an interesting archaeological area, and the settlement grew, and it grew and seems to have been important as a port for the export of wood, in particular from Andalusia, which was very wooded at the time. North Africa was not, and it seems that the Moors used Gibraltar as a port for the exportation of wood, as I'm sure of other things. The Gibraltar changed hands several times between the Moors and the predecessors of Spain during a period up to 1462. In 1462, it was taken over by Juan Alonso de Guzman, who was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and then it was on and off Spanish or from some Moorish dynasty, including the Nasrids and the Marinids, until 1704, which was the date when a combined British and Dutch force took Gibraltar during the War of Spanish Succession. Gibraltar has been British ever since. Totting it up, it was Spanish for around 240 years. It's been British for 317 years, which is significant when it comes to talking about sovereignty disputes. During the British times, there were a number of sieges in which Spanish forces besieged the rock. They moved right down to the base of the rock and bombarded Gibraltar from the sea. In some cases, leveling virtually the whole town, which had to be rebuilt. Again, that's subject for another day. The most significant was the Great Siege, which lasted from 1779 to 1783. British occupation, if you can call it that, really transformed into Gibraltarian identity, because at the time of the British arriving in 1704, most of the Spanish population there left Gibraltar. Some of them came back, but Gibraltar was then subsequently populated by different Mediterranean nationalities, including some Moors, including Jews from North Africa, including Maltese who came as a labor force and stayed, Genoese who were great merchants and traders in the Mediterranean who came and saw commercial opportunities in Gibraltar and settled in Gibraltar. And of course, British, particularly the armed forces, British Army, Navy, no Air Force then, of course, and some of them stayed in Gibraltar. And Gibraltar nowadays is a very diverse population made up of people of Spanish, Genoese, Maltese, English, Scottish, Irish, Moorish descent, also Hindu, and in more recent years in particular, Moroccans who came to Gibraltar after the border closed in 1969, about which more in a little while. It was really during the course of the 20th century, though, that Gibraltar became and started to develop more of an identity as a civilian community. It was, of course, still very much a colony of the British and a military base, and the civilian population, even though it was growing and more diverse and increasingly wealthy, was, for example, not allowed to travel to the upper reaches of what we know as the Upper Rock, which is now a nature reserve. I even remember when I was a small child, we had to ask permission to go onto the Upper Rock and get the military authorities to allow us to do so. But it was during the 20th century, and certainly a lot before I was old enough to remember things, that Gibraltar developed its own identity. Clearly, the two world wars had a very large impact on Gibraltar. The First World War, possibly less so, but Europe was not in a good place after the First World War. And there are, in fact, records of many Gibraltarians who left Gibraltar for the United States during the early 1920s. I, in fact, in a recent visit to Ellis Island, I have a sister who lives in New Jersey, and I visit her as often as I can. I love your country. And I visited Ellis Island, and I actually looked through their records and found the record of a great aunt of mine, or great-great aunt perhaps, who had actually been allowed into the United States through Ellis Island in 1921. Sadly, we've lost track of the Corteses in the United States, but there was a sizable emigration. And I say emigration because most of the people who left Gibraltar for the United States, and some actually ended up in Jamaica, actually stayed there and didn't come back. Now, this is a marked contrast to what happened during the Second World War. During the Second World War, of course, it was a much more mechanized warfare, and there were more ships involved, and clearly the Air Force started to play a big part. And therefore, Gibraltar was under threat. Strategically, it was critically important for the Allies, not just for the British, but significantly for the United States. And Eisenhower, in fact, had a base in Gibraltar, and the place within one of the many tunnels in the rock is still conserved in tribute to the United States participation. But Gibraltar was at risk. It was at risk from airstrikes from both the German air forces and the French once they capitulated. And therefore, most of the civilian population was evacuated from Gibraltar. This was not an emigration, this was a forced evacuation. And fortunately, although it's a long, long story, most of them did return. The evacuation had a profound effect on Gibraltar as a community. Some men were allowed to stay behind. My own father, who worked with the military in communications, was required to stay in Gibraltar, whereas my mother had to leave. She was evacuated to Madeira in the Atlantic, one of the Atlantic islands. There were evacuations to Jamaica, to Northern Ireland, and significantly and perhaps surprisingly to London, where many more bombs fell than fell on Gibraltar, where only a couple fell. That was a traumatic time for Gibraltarians. Gibraltarians living away from home, missing their homeland, developed a sense of identity almost in exile. as refugees, essentially, that really sealed the identity of the Gibraltarians to this day. They eventually returned to Gibraltar, starting in 1945, but some were not sent back for a variety of reasons. Again, a story in itself, until 5 or 6 years later. But they came back with this identity and with this desire to develop as a community and to develop political independence from the colonial authorities. And this, in fact, happened. And a person who then became Gibraltar's first chief minister, Sir Joshua Hassan, a prominent lawyer from the Jewish community, set up the Gibraltar Association for the Advancement of Civil Rights, which became de facto Gibraltar's first political party, and eventually resulted in the UK government agreeing to a new constitution, which created the House of Assembly, which was a step up from the City Council and the Legislative Council, which was still largely colonial, into the House of Assembly under the new constitution of 1968 or 69. I would need to check that fact, but it was around that time. This did not help the more recent political history of Gibraltar. And it's interesting to note that whereas the previous history of Gibraltar is geographical, is anecdotal, the recent history of Gibraltar is almost exclusively political if you're not careful. Great things have happened to develop Gibraltar as a community, its cultural identity, its literature, which is blossoming at the moment, but we tend to fall into the trap of mainly remembering Gibraltar's recent political history. And why should that be? Well, Gibraltar is claimed by the Kingdom of Spain, and that is a fact. Situation now I'll describe in a minute, but perhaps what triggered the latest and possibly the most significant and cruelest siege because of the context in the 20th century was the visit by Her Majesty the Queen in 1954 to Gibraltar. She was welcomed like all royals are in Gibraltar. Gibraltar is very British, very patriotic. And one of the things that keeps Gibraltar British is this monarchy, which is detached from political governments, which is isolated from any action that a political government or prime minister might take, which may be more or less to the liking of the community. The Queen and the monarchy are always there, and they're consistent, and they give relevance to Britishness. This is something that I feel, having grown up in British Gibraltar. But when the Queen visited Gibraltar, great offense was taken by General Franco, who was then the fascist dictator of Spain. And remember that this fascist dictator was an ally of Hitler. He had planned to invade Gibraltar, and if Hitler had invaded Gibraltar, the Second World War could have taken a very different turn, because remember, Gibraltar was a platform for the North African operation of the Allies, which started the end of the Nazi regime. But Franco was ideologically aligned to Hitler. And Franco then, who was having his own problems in Spain, decided to put pressure on Gibraltar and wanted to reactivate the claim to the sovereignty of Gibraltar, which had been not extinct, if I can compare it to a volcano, but certainly relatively dormant for some time. There was great camaraderie between the British forces and Spain. The governor of Gibraltar would host the Spanish governor of Algeciras, and vice versa. There was a fox hunt. The traditional red and white fox hunters would take their beagles across the Spanish countryside, chasing foxes. So there was a great deal of rapprochement, for want of a better word, during that time. But then Franco came along and with the offense he took at the Queen's visit, put on the pressure. So from a fairly free-flowing border in which Gibraltarians had residences in Spain, the vast majority of the labor force in Gibraltar, including that working in the British dockyard, the British military dockyard, was Spanish. Pressure mounted until the point when, because Gibraltar was not willing to go in the direction of Spanish sovereignty, and I'll talk about the referendum in a little bit, Spain under Franco closed the border. And this is something which in Gibraltar we're used to saying, yes, the border was closed. The border was closed when I was 13 in 1969, and it remained closed virtually throughout my teenage years. So during that time, I was unable to cross the border. So we were stuck, for want of a better word. We made the most of it, and Gibraltar again flourished as a community and grew as a community, but we were unable to cross the border. This meant that those families who were split, who had families in Spain, as I did, my aunt lived in Spain. She ended up leaving and coming to Gibraltar to stay with us. Those families who were split, remember, these were days when we didn't have internet, we didn't have mobile phones. Phone lines were cut by the Franco regime, so you couldn't make a call on a landline. If a new baby was born in Gibraltar, they would take the baby to the frontier and hold him or her up, and about 500 meters away, the Spanish side of the family would be there, waving and wanting to see the new baby. They would call via a loud hailer, perhaps announcing a birth, a wedding, or the death of an elderly relative. It was that bad. It was the Berlin Wall in Western Europe, and the world almost didn't even notice. I don't know whether it cared, but it happened, and it happened in 1969. Gibraltar as a community grew stronger. When you have a common enemy, you tend to do that. And it was a strategy by the Spanish authorities of the time which failed. If you want to win somebody's affection, you don't treat them badly. If I want to make friends with my neighbor, I don't throw a flower pot at his or her head when I walk out of my house every morning. I will embrace them, I will encourage them, I will invite them for a meal, invite them for tea, as we do in British Gibraltar, in order to win them over. Franco failed. Franco closed the border, cut down families, cut telephone lines, stopped oxygen coming to the hospital, stopped wine coming to our churches, and we had to rely on and cut off, obviously, the labor force. So the labor force was withdrawn overnight. A lot of volunteers came forward. Moroccans came to Gibraltar to work. Many of them would go back at weekends on a ferry to see their families. Others settled in Gibraltar, and now we have a fairly large British Moroccan community who have contributed a great deal to helping Gibraltar survive during the time of the blockade. But it was a time in which Gibraltar grew as a community. I myself became interested in natural history, and certainly our knowledge of Gibraltar's natural history grew at a time where we could go nowhere else. And organizations such as the Scouts flourished, and as I say, the Gibraltar community gelled at the time and its identity. This was, as I say, in 1969, and this is more or less where I come in. I was born in 1956, and when I think about it, that was just 11 years after the end of the Second World War. When I think that that would mean that if I'd been born now, the Second World War would have ended in 2010, it really brings to mind how close I was to that conflict and how influenced my parents will have been by experience during that time. Just not particularly relevant to this. Up in the I had a younger sibling, and my elder brother and sister grew up with the sound of the Beatles. In the years of the hippies, they weren't hippies themselves, but there was a great liberation movement, and I was very influenced in that. And I think that is why my politics are pretty left-wing. I make no apologies, and it's certainly something that I'll talk about when I come to talking about my political career. But if I can go back to just before the border closed, because Gibraltar, if you look at Gibraltar, we have a Facebook page called Speak Freely. And there everybody has a go at everybody else. And if you see that and you use that as a reflection of the Gibraltar community, you're going to say, these people can't stand each other. They're always criticizing each other. But actually, that is not the case, because, as I said before, when you have a common objective or when you have a common enemy, and I don't consider Spain an enemy now, I'm talking at it in the context of the Franco regime. Let me make that very clear. Things have moved a long way. But it does make you think with one mind. And in 1967, we had a referendum, and the referendum was a simple choice. You either chose continuing links with Britain or the move to the sovereignty of Spain. The result, links with Britain, 12,138 votes, links with Spain, 44. Yes, 44. And at least one voter realized that they'd voted wrong. So let's call it 43. That's 99.64%. Clear, a very clear answer. But that isn't the only one. We had another referendum much more recently in 2002, when the Tony Blair government of the UK was talking to the Spanish government about a joint sovereignty deal, which they thought might deal with the Gibraltar situation. Well, that was put to a referendum, and there the noes had it by 98.97%. More recently, and I'll talk about Brexit in a minute, more recently, the Brexit referendum was clearly a vote in favor of remaining in Gibraltar. 92.9% voted to remain within the European Union. It didn't happen because the majority in England didn't, but that's another story. If I can come back to perhaps placing myself in context, I went to school in Gibraltar. I was educated by the Loreto Nuns and the Christian Brothers, both very Catholic organizations, no longer present in Gibraltar. I went to Royal Holloway in London, and then I went to Magdalen College in Oxford, where I studied animal ecology. And this was an inspirational time in Oxford. We had eminent scientists like David MacDonald, a prominent animal behaviorist, John Krebs, son of the Krebs who discovered the Krebs cycle. Any students of biology will be aware of the Krebs cycle. And he was the CEO of the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, and many else. And Richard Dawkins, the author of The Selfish Genes and other publications. Since I crossed his path every morning on the way to work, and we'd say hello with a smile. So it was a very inspirational time in Oxford. And I think that together with my education here and the experience I had as a scout, which did a lot for me during the closed border, I think that set me up for something that I never thought would happen, which is getting into politics. At the same time, I co-founded the Gibraltar Ornithological and Natural History Society, which was Gibraltar's first and remains one of the foremost NGOs in Gibraltar. My studies are biological. I directed the Botanic Gardens, as you heard in the introduction. That came about, though, in a very interesting way, because when I came back to Gibraltar after my studies, I took a job in the civil service. There were no openings in biology. And then I ended up managing the Gibraltar Health Authority because I was interested in healthcare administration. I took that post at the age of 32 with no healthcare experience. Again, found myself in a situation that I had never predicted, and I actually ran 2 hospitals at that time, did a bit of research in my spare time. But then the opportunity came. These gardens, which are now the Gibraltar Botanic Gardens, were a public park that was derelict. And I thought, well, it would be nice to go back and practice what I've learned as a biologist. And I took over as director of the Botanic Gardens, and I stayed there, working there for 20 years. Again, the next step was very, very unexpected. And that was my move into politics. The administration at the time had been in power for 16 years. They were the Gibraltar Social Democrats, a party which is still in opposition. To my mind, their politics were not good for Gibraltar. I found that the government, after all that time, had become, there was a little bit of democratic deficit. And one thing that really, really bothered me was there was no flavor of environmentalism, and there was no appetite for moving Gibraltar forward in environmental governance. There was no talk of energy efficiency. There was no talk of renewable energy. The word sustainability was almost taboo within government circles. And it was very frustrating for somebody who'd given his first talk on the greenhouse effect in 1983 to an audience of 10 people to see that all these years later, Gibraltar was still not moving in the direction that I thought it should move. I was friends with the then leader of my party, the Gibraltar Socialist Labour Party, and he was trying very hard to convince me to enter politics. But I think my family did it. Most families would have probably been a little bit averse to this. But I remember my son and my daughter and my wife, of course, saying, look, John, you keep on complaining that Gibraltar isn't going the way you want it. We're fed up of hearing you say that. You either do something about it and stand for election or don't mention it again. It was a difficult decision because I was very happy with what I was doing. But I think I did what I had to do, and I stood for election. I took my decision in October 2019, and in December 2011, sorry, I beg your pardon, 2019 was the last election. Took my decision in October 2011, and on the 9th of December 2011, almost 10 years, within the next few weeks, it'll be 10 years, I became Minister for the Environment and Minister for Health in Her Majesty's Government of Gibraltar. Had you asked me a couple of years before, I would never have imagined that. And had you asked me when I was at university or when I was in the Botanic Gardens earlier on, I would never have imagined it. But what's the relevance? I mean, it's not about me. It's about how things happen. And it's about how the experiences one gains in life can actually help in doing things you never thought you would be doing. I stood for election. I was very new, 2 months in politics, and I came second in the poll after the person who was the party leader and who became chief minister. The thing I think that clinched it was the fact that I had been very active in the NGO world. I had been a very active environmentalist. Apart from my hobbies of being on the stage, which I love, that's another story for another day. Apart from the fact that I was president of the Magistrates Association, I was a justice of the peace and would sit in court, which gave me a feel for what was happening in the community. But nevertheless, I found myself there. It was a privilege and an honor, and quite moving, clearly. But it was a traumatic change. And another aside here, in every big decision in life, there comes one day you'll feel that it was the right decision, one day you'll feel that it was the wrong decision. But one of the things I think is good is that there are very few scientists in politics, and there are very few scientists in government. and there are very few environmentalists in real party politics, and very few environmentalists in government. And that is sad, and I think that is a problem. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've done in the last 10 years in government, which I think will express what I'm saying now. But the fact that a scientist can be in a decision-making position and can be a legislator jumps through so many hoops and jumps over so many steps in order to have effective environmental governance. Because normally you would have the NGOs lobbying, the scientific advisors advising, and the politician without any knowledge of science or natural sciences having to digest, understand, balance with everything else, and then make a decision. But that decision will never have the depth of knowledge that a scientist will have if he's making a decision which is one which is related to the environment or to science. And therefore, if nothing else, let this small contribution today be a call for those of you out there who are not career politicians, and most politicians in Gibraltar are lawyers, and nothing wrong with that. They bring tremendous experience, but we need other professions to be in politics, and we need other professions to have the courage to take the difficult decisions, to stand up and be counted. Scientists very often say negative things about politics, and I know this side, and some of those things are correct. But if we don't stand up and be counted, and we don't perhaps leave our research to one side, research which I love, and if you Google me and you put Barbary macaques, and you Google me and you put birds, and you Google me and you put a number of other things, you're going to find I have publications, scientific publications, which I have had to leave to one side, but because I believe in what I do. So enough about me. Let me talk now about our government program over the last 10 years. As I said just a short while ago, my party is the Gibraltar Socialist Labour Party. My leader and good friend is the Chief Minister, Fabian Picardo. And we are an alliance of the Socialist Labour Party and the Gibraltar Liberal Party, which is associated to Liberal International. The Gibraltar Liberal Party and the GSLP, as we call it, are an alliance in that we stood for election together rather than forming a coalition after being elected separately. So we have stood as one. And we have won 3 successive elections. The first one with a majority of about 200. The second one we had, I believe it was a 70% of the vote. And in the third one, again, we had over 50%. There's an election in 2 years' time. We'll see what happens. Politics is politics. So we were elected on a ticket of reform, of reduction of debt, and of largely increasing the proper environmental governance of Gibraltar. Our last election was particularly green. Clearly, as the years gone by and we realized the dangers of the climate crisis, politics has responded. And our last manifesto, which is available online in a website called generations, plural, .gi. That's generations.gi. That's our Green Gibraltar Manifesto, which commits us to a lot. So we brought about a number of social changes, and I believe that we were able to carry out a large number of changes in Gibraltar because, and this is where I come to governance and government in small jurisdictions. In a small jurisdiction where you have ministers who come out directly from the community, who retain links with the community, who sit as ministers on being elected without having to go through all the stages in a political party, for example, and as I say, who keep contact with the community, it is much easier and more and much more efficient when it comes to carrying out your policies, carrying out your project, and carrying out legislation. I'll give you a few examples. In our first year in government, we had a government budget surplus of, I seem to recall, about 16 million pounds. You can convert it to dollars. I should do it. It'll be a few more dollars than that. So we dedicated 10 million of those pounds to setting up a brand new University of Gibraltar. University of Gibraltar is now about 6 or 7 years old. I'm also the minister responsible for the university. I'm a professor at university. I'm very proud of the university. You can Google University of Gibraltar and you can see how it has grown and continues to grow. So that is one very quick way in which we could take a very quick decision and create something like a university. The number of state, and we legislated and created the Gibraltar University Act, and the university is recognized internationally. The number of stages you would need in a larger jurisdiction in order to establish a new university with local authorities and regional authorities and all sorts of coordinating bodies and statutory bodies would have made the creation of a new university very, very much more difficult and very much slower. There were other things that we did, perhaps more controversially. We introduced civil partnerships between same gender or opposite gender. We introduced single-sex marriage. And most recently, after a referendum, we legislated in favor of allowing abortion in Gibraltar. This is very controversial. I am a practicing Catholic. If you're interested in that particular angle, is something that you can take up. You can look at the parliament.gi website, and you can look at Hansard, which goes to the debate, and you can read my speech, which I think would be of interest to those of you who are interested in the particular aspect of abortion. Financial regulation in Gibraltar is extremely good. Gibraltar is considered a safe jurisdiction for financial services. Traditionally, Spain through the years has wanted to give Gibraltar a bad name in financial services, calling us a fiscal paradise, which we are not. We are very well regulated. We have very stringent laws and a very effective and robust management of all financial transactions. But another thing that we've done is we've changed Gibraltar's infrastructure, if I may say, beyond recognition. Power generation in Gibraltar, when I became minister for the environment, and shortly after I was minister for energy for about 3 or 4 years, was through very old diesel plants. They were very old, they were decades old, they were certainly past their sell-by dates, and highly contaminating. There had been a proposal from the outgoing government to build a diesel generating plant in the nature reserve. That is something that I had campaigned against when I was in the NGO, and I found myself then in a position in the government where I could actually influence and take decisions to reverse that. And we did reverse it. We stopped that project because Gibraltar has not yet got enough renewable. There were no renewables at all at the time, and we couldn't rely on renewables exclusively. What we did was we set up a liquid natural gas power station in the port away from urban areas in order to be able to generate enough power for the whole of Gibraltar while reducing the amount of pollution, because LNG emits much less carbon, sulfur dioxide and particles, much less than diesel. So we have gone a long way to improving our air quality, and we now have a more reliable and less polluting source of power. It's still fossil fuel, and our strategy still wants to move in the direction of renewable energy, but it was a definite step in the right direction. While on the subject of energy, again, 10 years ago, there were no solar installations at all. We have now got installed capacity of about 10% of our energy from solar, and this will be expanding. And because we don't have space on land for wind turbines, we are looking at offshore wind, and we're also looking at harnessing the power of the sea, but that technology is a little bit behind. Other projects that we have carried out was a new mental home, 2 dementia homes, 2 primary care centers, an elderly care day center. We were able to localize a lot of the health provision. Gibraltar has a very good general hospital, but for tertiary care, we tend to send our patients to the United Kingdom or to Spain, but we have localized some chemotherapy, for example, is now in Gibraltar. In the last 10 years, we have built 7 new schools, and there are 3 more under construction. We need to do 2 more, which we hope to be able to start during this term of office, to have completely renewed the whole of the education real estate in Gibraltar, plus a university. At the same time, we've converted 2 car parking lots into parks to provide green areas in the heart of town with green lawns and with a lot of trees in order to give this feeling of well-being that green spaces bring into the heart of any community. So I'm not going to go through the whole of the government program, and I'm not saying we've done everything right. We have one major problem, and that is our sewage, which still goes into the sea untreated. We have tried very hard to resolve this. Unfortunately, we have been victims of a number of negative coincidences, one being Brexit. We had investment from the European Investment Bank, which was going to pay for this. And in 2016, when the United Kingdom voted out of the EU, this funding was withdrawn. Then we sought additional funding. The project for the sewage plant was allocated to a joint venture company from the United Kingdom. One of the partners in the joint venture went bankrupt, and therefore we had to start the process all over again. So we are now considering another 3 or 4 proposals in order to start that project. So this is one that I'm very, very saddened have not been able to put across, but a lot of work has been done. On environmental governance, we have passed over 200 items of environmental legislation, a lot more legislation as well, like renewing the Mental Health Act, which was decades old. But in these 200 items, we have banned the release of balloons. Our National Day was traditionally marked with the release of 30,000, one for each member of the population, red and white balloons. Red and white are the colors of the Gibraltar flag. So we've banned the release of balloons. We've banned the use of circus animals, of dolphinaria. We've banned the importation of single-use plastic. We've protected all sharks and rays in our waters. We have legislated against the emission of black smoke in ships. We've expanded our protected areas. So now 39% of our land area is a nature reserve, having increased in extent by about 37% since 10 years ago. So we have taken the opportunity to increase the protection of the environment. And most recently, last week, on the last day of COP, we published our climate change strategy, which has very ambitious plans to make us carbon neutral within the next few decades. And again, the Gibraltar climate change strategy can be accessed online. So as I come to the end of this presentation, what of the very recent past and what of the future? I have to mention Brexit. As I said, the Gibraltar community voted overwhelmingly to stay within the EU for a number of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, I perhaps myself, I'm a committed European. I believe in the European project. The EU wasn't doing everything right, but the EU, ironically, because a lot of the United Kingdom's campaign for Brexit was saying that the EU threatened British sovereignty. In our case, the EU protected our sovereignty and guaranteed our rights of passage through the whole of Europe, including through the border with Spain. I said earlier that I don't consider Spain an enemy, and I don't think any Gibraltarian considers Spain an enemy like it was in the Franco regime. But we still are claimed by our neighbors. But I am very pleased at the way things have developed in recent years. And although there are still occasional tensions, it must be said that Brexit is now being seen by the current government of Spain as something that we have to work through. I repeat what I said before, there's about 12 to 15,000 Spanish residents who work in Gibraltar. So any difficulty at the border would obviously impact the Gibraltarian community, but it would also impact the community in the surrounding area of Andalusia tremendously, by resulting in potentially 15,000 people out of work. And traditionally, the south of Spain has been an area with very high unemployment. And Gibraltar is the second largest employer, taken together, is the second largest employer in Andalusia after the regional government of Andalusia. So we contribute significantly to the economy of the surrounding area. And the current government of Spain recognizes that. And therefore, when Brexit became effective about nearly 2 years ago now, we were able to negotiate an interim agreement known as the New Year's Eve Agreement, because it was agreed at the crunch 11th hour, almost literally, on the 31st of December last year, which allowed freedom of movement for Gibraltarian residents and other facilities, including, for example, being able to take your dog for a walk in Spain using your current pet passport, with a view to then consolidating that interim agreement into a treaty. And there are now currently treaty negotiations between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom on one side, and the European Union with Spain, obviously as part of the Union, on the other. And we are hoping that we will be able to reach an agreement, and that a treaty will be signed before the end of the year to allow the development of our relations. The fact that sovereignty is claimed does not mean that we cannot get on like we have done in the past. There's huge potential here for economic development. Gibraltar is, unfortunately, because of COVID, and I'll come to this in a minute, economically for the last 2 years, we have not been in the position we like to be, but we will recover. Gibraltar is economically strong. We have a lot of expertise in a broad variety of areas, but we lack the manpower, and we lack the space which is available across the border. So good communication, mutual respect, and intelligent discussion could lead to a boom in our region. Clearly, as long as I'm here, I'm going to make sure that that is not to the detriment of the environment, because it doesn't need to be. I must mention COVID, because COVID came upon all of us. Gibraltar, I think, I also have responsibility for public health, and I think we dealt with the COVID threat, and are still dealing with the COVID threat robustly, making our own decisions based on our own experience, based on public health advice for our own little Gibraltar. So one of the first things we did was a lockdown for the over 70s, well before we considered anybody else, because of the high propensity to serious ill health and death. We were able to keep deaths at bay until the very end of last year, and January and February this year, when unfortunately COVID got into our elderly residential areas, and we lost approximately 95 of our elderly residents. in a small community, you virtually know them all. It was a very sad time for Gibraltar. And more recently, one or two people with comorbidities have also passed away, but we haven't reached the 100. It's about 97, 98. Very, very sad. But on the whole, we have managed it well. We are very largely vaccinated. One of the positives of being an overseas territory of the United Kingdom is that the United Kingdom has provided us with enough vaccines for the whole population. We are now having our boosters and vaccinating children down to the age of 12 and waiting for UK advice on younger children. But COVID had a great economic impact. We had to close down commerce. We had to close down tourism. And for the first time, for many, many years, certainly for the first time since we've been in government, we had a budget deficit of about £140 million, which for a small size is a lot of money. And we are suspecting that although the economy is recovering, we will have a deficit of around 50 million this coming year. But obviously, we've taken a hit. Some of our ambitious projects in the manifesto have had to be held back, like the construction of 3 new parks, the construction of a national theatre, and a number of other projects. We've had to just take a step back, but we are obviously continuing to plan for them and hoping that they will come to fruition. I'll end up there. I know I've overrun, and I know that we have about 20 minutes for questions. So I hope I haven't rambled too much, but let me just say one thing to end off. None of this was planned. When I set off in my career, I had no idea I'd be doing what I'm doing. No regrets, really. But for young people who are studying now, I'm not in any way wanting to be patronizing. I'm not a patronizing sort of person, but make the most of all your life's experiences, be they good or bad, because you never know what you're going to end up doing. Thank you very much for your time.
So, Minister Cortez, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. So my first question is kind of logistics. Is it difficult to be a minister? Is it difficult to be a politician with such a large role in such a small community?
Yes, it is. I can say most definitely it's difficult. You are very close to everybody, and you know everybody, and sometimes you have to take decisions that are not going to be popular. I am approached by people, but people also assume that a minister has more power than he or she has. People who know me, who I've been to school with, look, my grandson is looking for a job and he's applied for this. Can you make sure that he gets it? Well, I can't. And if he doesn't, sometimes it's taken personally. I think I've lost a couple of friends because I haven't been able to do for them what they thought I could. I suspect if you think about it, they probably weren't real friends, because I've kept a lot of friends. Most of my friends are still there. But it is difficult. You also tend to, because you're so busy, you tend to lose contact. I don't shy away. I walk through the streets. I talk to whoever wants to talk to me. But there are pressures, and there are pressures on the family. I've got 2 children, one of them in Gibraltar, who has 2 children. So I've got 2 young grandchildren, and therefore sometimes I can't spend the time with them that some of other people my age do. But there are tensions. Here in Gibraltar, you see your constituents every day. You can't just drive away to the countryside and hide away elsewhere. So yes, it is not easy.
Thank you. Do any of you all have questions off the top of your head at the moment? I've got a few. Yeah, okay. Do you want to just, yeah, go ahead.
How did Brexit affect the job?
So the question from a student here is, how did Brexit affect your job and affect your role? And I had a question too, is how do you think it's affected Gibraltar positively, I guess?
Okay,
So
yeah. I like the question because it had a great effect. It had a huge effect. When the Brexit referendum was held, none of us expected the result. Clearly, in Gibraltar, we were all campaigning for Remain, and we were watching the UK campaign. I won't comment on the UK campaign, but there were things about it that I didn't like. We weren't expecting it. We were getting ready for it. But Brexit took over our political agenda. We had to plan for it in many different ways. We had to undo a lot of legislation because most of our laws were effectively European directives and European laws, which either applied directly or had been transposed to Gibraltar law. So we didn't undo in the sense that we stopped applying them, but we had to legislate in order to make them part of Gibraltar law. That took the whole of our legal advisory team away from day to day for years. We had to hold meetings with different stakeholders in Gibraltar, looking at what Brexit could do on food imports, on disposal of waste, on regulation of doctors. We held regular meetings. When I say we, I mean all my colleagues, particularly obviously the Chief Minister, the Deputy Chief Minister, the Attorney General, the Financial Secretary. It took up so much time that our domestic agenda was put back tremendously. How has that affected Gibraltar? At the moment, so I'll just have a sip of water. I've been talking a lot. At the moment, not as much as it could because of this interim deal that we were able to negotiate, which still allows the passage of people, but there have been problems. If there is no treaty, we would have to look at the way we export our waste, because a lot of it goes to Spain. Our recycling goes to Spain. The passage of people is important. I mentioned before the number of people who work in Gibraltar. We've had to relook at how we import food, because all food would pass without a problem throughout European territory. Now the United Kingdom, we get most of our groceries from the United Kingdom. Most of our fresh produce comes from Spain or Morocco, but most of our other groceries come from United Kingdom. So it has to be exported from a non-EU country and imported into the EU, and then exported from the EU when it crosses the border to Gibraltar. So some of the transits via vehicle is not allowed because the frontier post in Gibraltar is not a recognized border inspection post. So the big supermarkets have had to shift some of their goods onto ships. So they are driven down through Spain, and then some products have to come by sea. So it's extremely complicated. Things are changing all the time. At the moment, things have settled, but then every time I go, I travel through Spain, I have to have my passport stamped. I have been stripped of my European nationality through no fault of mine. And it's interesting for being a British Gibraltarian who has resisted being stripped of his British nationality all his life, having been stripped of my European nationality without any choice is not something that I appreciated.
Hi. Oh.
Good.
Hello, sorry. I was just kind of curious if you see, sorry for the shadow backline. I'm sorry, I was wondering if you see any advantages to pivoting towards like climate adaptation and mitigation policies in a smaller community. Are there any advantages or maybe things that larger governments maybe don't have to deal with, or like vice versa?
From a climate change perspective, you're saying? Okay, this is an interesting point. I mean, I could have mentioned a lot of other things that we didn't have time to. Our carbon emissions are about 300,000 tons a year, which is minuscule on a global scale. but we feel a responsibility to reduce it. And in fact, it is coming down because of a series of measures. We have a problem in mitigation because of our lack of space. We don't have space for solar farms. We don't have space for wind farms. So our strategy in moving towards renewable is not easy. It's tough because of our lack of space, whereas this wouldn't be the case in larger areas. There is a possibility of a cable link to Morocco, which exports renewable energy, and that is constantly being looked at. So that's one angle. There's another element of our carbon footprint, which is very difficult for us to control, and that is shipping. We have a bunkering industry in Gibraltar. So we are responsible for selling fossil fuel. That is scope 3 in our assessment. It's something that we cannot directly control. And the thing is that if we were, for example, to say stop selling of fuel bunkers, the ships would go across the bay to Algeciras or across the straits to Ceuta, which is a Spanish enclave in Morocco, and they'd take the bunkers there. So it would still be very close to us, and somebody else would be making the money, which we need for our economy and also for our mitigation and adaptation. So it is, but there is a move. So for things like aviation and bunkering and shipping, we do rely on the international community. There is a move towards zero carbon shipping. The Clydebank Declaration aims to have zero carbon corridors between ports and zero carbon shipping by 2050. And in fact, during COP, the US government committed to the Clydebank Declaration, and they are aiming for zero carbon shipping by 2050. This could come by way of moving from heavy fuels to LNG and even to hydrogen. Excuse me. So there are constraints on what we can do. From the point of view of adaptation, most of the overseas territories, and I've just come back from a conference with the leaders of the other overseas territories, most of the overseas territories are islands. We are a near island. So the threat to us from rising sea level is significant. We are now building anything we build on the coast with much higher sea walls and sea defenses. A 1 meter rise could wipe out our airfield, which, as you saw earlier, is on reclaimed land. A 2 meter rise would wipe out much of our residential areas. And we don't want to talk about the 3 meter rise because that could wipe out the whole of the lower town of Gibraltar. So we are aware there are difficulties in a small territory, but there are other things we can do more quickly.
Thank you. Does anyone have additional? Yeah.
I was just wondering if there was ever a push for independence to be no longer dependent on the British. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. There hasn't been a strong move for independence, I think for a number of reasons. There has been the opposite move, a move for integration to become part of the United Kingdom, like the Canary Islands and Ceuta and Melilla are for Spain, or like Martinique and other overseas territories of France. They are considered an integral part of French territory. And French laws apply directly, whereas Gibraltar is an overseas territory and internally self-governing. So at the moment, I think the push would probably still be in that direction. We have a large amount of self-government, probably more than Scotland. I often say that if Scotland had the same amount of self-government as we do, perhaps they wouldn't be pushing for independence as the Scottish National Party is, although clearly the last referendum did not vote in favor of that. There are sentimental links to the British Crown, as I mentioned before. There are also practical issues like guaranteeing our sovereignty and guaranteeing our independence. The Treaty of Utrecht, which I didn't mention, I meant to, which ceded Gibraltar to the United Kingdom, says that Spain would have to have first refusal before being given to another power. So one would perhaps, they might interpret it as they're having to have first refusal before we went into independence, or I don't think that is the case at all. At the moment, I don't think there is a need for independence because of the fact that the United Kingdom does respect our self-government. We're not under any kind of threat of being taken over. And I think British sovereignty does give us certain guarantees, but who's to say what might happen in the future?
Hello, thank you for talking to us. So I was wondering, what is public opinion on abortion and same-sex marriage? And you kind of touched upon that it was controversial. So I was wondering who advocated for the passing of these progressive laws?
All right, well, I'll start with abortion, which is the most recent one. And that was the subject of a referendum earlier this year. I believe I can't remember the exact result. I'm sure you can Google it and find it while I'm talking. There was a majority in favor of abortion. There's a couple of considerations here. There is a precedent in Northern Ireland where the United Kingdom took a view that constitutionally, because of human rights, the government of Northern Ireland had to allow abortion. And there was a real possibility that if Gibraltar didn't legislate to allow the possibility of abortion, that it could be that the United Kingdom, which still has certain constitutional powers over Gibraltar, would force us to legislate in that direction. And this was something that we would rather not have. We would rather have the choice put through the Gibraltar Parliament and through the Gibraltar people in a plebiscite, which is what the referendum said. There were differing views. Religious communities particularly were opposed to the possibility of abortion. But I think one of the practical points is that because of our small size and our proximity to Spain, women who wanted to have abortions were having them in Spain and in the United Kingdom anyway, and were just having these operations, or whatever you want to call them, performed anyway. So I don't think that the fact that it is now permissible by law in Gibraltar going to result in any more abortions than were happening anyway. So the pragmatist would say that it really didn't make a difference from that point of view, that we weren't opening the doors to encouraging abortion, but making it something that could be openly discussed because it wasn't an illegal act, meant that perhaps women would be more likely to seek advice, which might in fact result in their not having an abortion where otherwise they may have had. So it's a peculiar situation in Gibraltar, very different to anywhere else. As far as same-sex marriage goes, we started off with civil partnerships, which was fairly widely accepted. Same-sex marriage, once again, there was opposition mainly from religious groups, but that was nowhere as controversial as abortion, and that went through without much difficulty. That didn't go to a referendum. That was by government majority in Parliament.
All right, we have time for about one more question. If anyone has, oh, sorry. Right here, hold on. All right, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak to us. It's been very interesting. It seems that Gibraltar has managed Brexit quite well so far. Do you, relatively speaking, do you think there's anything for Northern Ireland to learn from Gibraltar in their coping with Brexit?
That's a very good question, a very difficult one too. There are critical differences. One of them being the fact that we don't have a border with the United Kingdom in the sense that Northern Ireland does. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, we are not part of the United Kingdom. And therefore, passage of people or passage of goods into Gibraltar isn't opening the floodgates to passage of goods and people without additional control into the Great Britain part of the United Kingdom. So there is a critical difference there, which is why sometimes people compare the two, but as I say, there is a critical difference there. Whether there are any lessons, you're asking the wrong person, because I believe in the EU. I wouldn't have liked Brexit to happen. I believe in the international dimension, the wide-ranging opportunities given to people to travel throughout the European Union. So I don't know whether there are any lessons, but certainly there's a critical difference in that we are not a floodgate to Europeans going into the UK, whereas Northern Ireland, some people see it as such.
Well, that is the time we have for today. Thank you, Minister Cortez, for joining us and for coming to the great state of North Carolina. We hope, we hope to get you here sometime in person. We will share your information with students if they have any other questions. But again, thank you, and we appreciate
My
it.
pleasure. If I may just say, I'm very happy to answer questions and to assist in any way that I can if anybody's interested in any aspect of what I've covered today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.